November 14, 1942. 0320 hours. Ironbottom Sound, south of Guadalcanal. Admiral Willis A. Lee stood on the bridge of the USS Washington, the flagship of a fleet groping through black water. The battle ahead was invisible. The enemy, the Japanese battleship Kirishima, had slipped beyond the horizon. No moonlight, no searchlights, nothing to aim at. On the plotting board, a single green pulse blinked across a new device the men barely trusted. The Mark 8 fire control radar. It showed range, bearing, and motion where human eyes saw only dark. The guns of Washington could strike targets 12 miles away, but no Navy had ever hit what it could not see. Lee hesitated. The rules of gunnery said wait for visual contact. The radar said fire. He gave the order. 30 seconds later, shells the size of automobiles arced into blackness and found their mark. A hit beyond sight, beyond doctrine, beyond explanation. That night, the United States Navy learned it could fight blind and still see. How could a machine know what even men could not? The naval war in the South Pacific had become a duel fought in darkness. By November of 1942, both fleets had learned to fear the night. Searchlights gave away position. Flares drew fire. The sea between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, soon to be called Ironbottom Sound, was a graveyard of ships that had dared to fight blind. Every rule said battleships should wait for daylight, where guns could aim by sight and rangefinders could see their prey. But this night would break those rules. Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, a Kentucky-born gunnery savant known to his men as Ching, had spent his career studying the mathematics of naval fire control. He had commanded destroyers, tested rangefinders, and taught the geometry of gunnery long before radar existed. Now, aboard the USS Washington, he faced a battle his textbooks had never imagined, a fight where light itself was the enemy. At 20 minutes past 3 in the morning, the Japanese battleship Kirishima, 2 heavy cruisers, and a screen of destroyers were closing from the north. They had already crippled the USS South Dakota. Washington was next. On the bridge, Lee stood beside the new Mark 8 radar repeater, a steel box no larger than a writing desk, humming faintly in the dark. Its green display swept in slow, hypnotic circles. Each pulse revealed echoes, ranges, bearings, movements no human eye could follow. In the plotting room below, sailors huddled over mechanical computers. The Ford Mark I fire control system, gears, dials, and electric motors, turned those echoes into firing solutions. Bearings adjusted, deflection set, range confirmed. Every few seconds, a young officer called out data points in a flat, clipped rhythm. Range, 18,000 yards. Closing fast. Lee knew he was about to trust the ocean to a machine. Washington's optical sights could see nothing. Rain hid everything. Only the radar spoke. When its pulse returned a clear trace at a range of 20,000 yards, Lee gave a quiet nod. The gunnery officer repeated the order. All main batteries, load armor piercing. Target bearing 146. Range 20,000. The plot continues. Down below, loaders slammed shells into breaches the size of bathtubs. Hydraulic doors sealed. The red lamps flickered. Men waited for the word that would cross them from training into legend. Lee took one last look into the black void ahead. A sea without horizon, without stars, and said simply, "We'll shoot by what we can't see." For centuries, naval warfare had obeyed a simple truth. You could only hit what you could see. The gunnery tables, the rangefinders, the optical directors, all were built on light, line of sight, and human judgment. But in 1942, light had become a liability. At night, a searchlight meant suicide. A gun flash gave away position. Even the faint spark of a cigarette on deck could betray a ship's bearing to an enemy cruiser waiting in ambush. The United States Navy had spent years searching for an answer. It came from engineers who built no ships and fired no guns, men from the Naval Research Laboratory and Bell Laboratories who dealt in invisible energy. They called it microwave radar. It could read the world not in light, but in echoes. The Mark 8 fire control radar, newly installed on Washington, was the first of its kind, a set that could track a moving ship beyond the horizon and feed exact bearings to the gunnery computer in real time. It was so new that few officers trusted it. The manual said its range extended to 40,000 yards. The gunnery instructors said the data couldn't be trusted beyond 15,000. Physics said that beyond the curvature of the Earth, radar shouldn't even work. Yet here it was, painting echoes from a target no one could see. The radar officer, Lieutenant Eugene Price, had tested the system only twice in calm weather. It had worked then, but now rain was falling, the sea was alive with reflections, and the screen was crowded with false ghosts. Each green arc that swept the display returned phantoms, clouds, waves, the faint shimmer of metallic interference. The true target had to be separated from illusion by experience, instinct, and luck. In the plotting room, the Ford Mark I computer processed the incoming data. It was a mechanical brain made of brass and gears, designed to solve equations in motion. It calculated the relative motion of both ships, corrected for wind, roll, drift, muzzle velocity decay, and even the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation. But none of that mattered if the input was wrong. If the radar echo was false, the entire firing solution would be nonsense. Admiral Lee understood this. A single misreading could send a full salvo of 16-inch shells, each weighing over a ton, vanishing harmlessly into the Pacific night. On the bridge, the radar trace steadied, bearing fixed, range constant. Against every rule of logic, the machine seemed sure of itself. Lee leaned forward and whispered to his gunnery officer, "If it's wrong, we'll miss by miles. If it's right, we'll make history." 0340 hours. Inside Washington's plotting room, the air was thick with heat and machine noise. The red lamps gave every face a copper glow. Operators spoke in fragments, half-whispered equations, bearing 146, range 18,000. Target speed 26 knots. The gears of the Ford computer hummed. The room smelled of oil and ozone, the breath of a living machine. On the bridge above, Admiral Lee checked the radar repeater again. The echo was steady now, a bright, unwavering trace sliding across the glass. The enemy was running parallel, unaware. In the old world of gunnery, Lee would have waited for silhouettes, funnels against moonlight, the glint of spray. But there was no moon, no horizon. The sea and sky had fused into one black wall. He nodded to the gunnery officer. All batteries ready. Deep within the armored citadel, loaders pulled levers. Breeches closed with a clang that vibrated through the decks. Every man knew what came next. 9 shells, each weighing 2,700 pounds, each containing the power of an airstrike, would leave the barrels at 2,000 feet per second. The first salvo thundered. The concussion flattened spray across the sea. Every sound vanished beneath it. On the radar, the trace flickered, then steadied again. 30 seconds later, the operator's voice cut through the static. "Splash! On target! Direct hit!" For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then another officer confirmed it. "Hit confirmed. Target range is decreasing." On the radar screen, the echo split in two. One contact slowed. The other scattered. Kirishima was burning. "The range now is 17,000. Lee gave a single order. "Repeat." The second salvo followed, timed by computer, adjusted by fractions of a degree. Again the guns fired into nothing, and again the ocean lit up. The impossible had repeated itself. Below decks, sailors stared at the plotting tables, unable to speak. Some crossed themselves, others laughed softly, the kind of laughter that hides disbelief. The radar officer just watched the green blip fade and said quietly, "Sir, she's going down." Admiral Lee didn't answer. He knew what had just happened would change warfare forever. They had fought blind, and won. The Battle of Guadalcanal raged for hours, but for the men aboard USS Washington, the war had narrowed to one rhythm, the heartbeat of the radar sweep. Every 30 seconds, the green line circled and returned with truth or silence. They no longer looked out to sea. They looked down into the light. In the Combat Information Center, young radar operators tracked the dying echoes of Kirishima's escort destroyers. The screen showed chaos, fragments of steel drifting through the water, signals breaking apart as the ships themselves broke apart. To the human eye, the ocean was empty. To the machine, it was full of ghosts. Above, Admiral Willis Lee remained still, one hand resting on the chart table. He had trained a generation of gunnery officers to think in lines and arcs, in azimuth and deflection. Tonight those lines had come alive. Washington's guns were no longer guided by eyesight or instinct, but by numbers that spoke with eerie certainty. The South Dakota, crippled earlier in the night, drifted through the dark, her lights flickering. Her crew watched in disbelief as Washington's guns fired again and again, each salvo invisible, each hit perfect. What they were witnessing wasn't just victory. It was transformation. The Kirishima rolled to port, burning from bow to stern. Her deck guns fired into nothing, blind to the enemy that had already calculated her death. In the control tower, her officers shouted orders drowned by the roar of exploding magazines. The battleship that had once escorted Yamato, pride of the Imperial Navy, vanished beneath black waves before dawn. At 0420 hours, the Echo disappeared from the radar. The operator called it one last time. Target lost. Range 0. Silence filled the room. Lee exhaled. Around him, men who had grown up believing in the eye, the compass, and the human hand now stood in awe of a box of circuits and gears. Washington had fired the first successful radar-directed broadside in naval history, a battle fought without vision, won by echoes. The old world had ended quietly beneath tropical rain. No flags, no music, just the hum of a machine that had, for one night, made the ocean think. When the order finally came, cease fire, the sea went quiet in a way no one expected. There was no cheer, no shout of triumph, only the faint hiss of rain on the bridge and the low moan of the wind through the antenna masts. The Washington's crew stood at their stations, still listening for echoes that no longer came. The radar screen was blank now. The green sweep traced empty water, its once living pulse fading into static. The enemy was gone. Kirishima, the ship that had hammered American forces only hours earlier, had disappeared beneath 600 feet of Pacific blackness. Her boilers were still hot when she sank. The sea swallowed her whole, then closed like a wound that refused to scar. Admiral Willis A said nothing. He simply stepped back from the radar repeater and looked at the faces around him. Tired, wet, and wordless. They had witnessed something new, something neither the textbooks nor the gunnery manuals could explain. The night had proven what no man had dared to imagine. Machines could fight a war of their own. Below decks, men walked among the hot steel of the turrets. The air was heavy with burnt powder and sweat. A gun captain named Walters touched the still-warm barrel of his 16-inch gun and said softly, "We hit what we couldn't see." Another replied, "Guess we ain't blind anymore." The words hung in the air, half pride, half disbelief. In the days that followed, the story spread quietly through the fleet. Washington's action report would later read in sterile language, "Enemy battleship destroyed by radar-directed gunfire at approximately 18,500 yards. No mention of miracle, no mention of doubt, just data. But to the men who had been there, it had felt like standing on the edge of something enormous and invisible. When the Washington steamed into Espiritu Santo for replenishment, officers from other ships came aboard to see the Mark 8 radar for themselves. They crowded around its small green screen, the hum of its circuits barely audible beneath the noise of the generator. It looked unremarkable, just a steel box with knobs, dials, and a faint smell of ozone. But every man in that compartment knew what it represented. From that night forward, fire control radar became the mind of the fleet. Optical rangefinders were still carried, but as a relic, an insurance policy against failure. Gunnery tables were rewritten. Training manuals were revised. Crews learned to trust data over instinct, machinery over eyesight. For centuries, naval warfare had been an art shaped by experience, courage, and human vision. Now it was becoming a science, precise, mechanical, and terrifyingly efficient. The Japanese never fully understood what had happened that night. Survivors from Kirishima's escorts reported being hit by shells that seemed to come from nowhere. Some believed aircraft had attacked them under cover of darkness. Others thought the Americans had used flares they could not see. No one imagined that the salvos had been guided by invisible waves of energy, a weapon that saw without light. Historians would later call it the birth of beyond visual range warfare. But for the men who fought it, it was simpler. The night the ocean changed its rules. The Mark 8 radar didn't just help aim guns, it rewired how sailors thought about distance, about perception, about what seeing even meant. In Washington, engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory read the battle reports with fascination. They compared radar logs to gunnery outcomes and found the data almost perfect. Hits were achieved at ranges previously considered unreachable, and adjustments were made not by human correction, but by electronic feedback. The Mark 8 had done more than prove itself. It had proven that human reaction time was now the slowest part of warfare. By 1943, radar-controlled gunnery became standard on every major U.S. battleship and cruiser. The Pacific turned into a battlefield of echoes. Unseen duels fought between signals and screens. When ships fired now, their gunners looked not to the horizon, but to glowing circles of light. The world had crossed an invisible frontier. Admiral Lee rarely spoke of that night. His after-action report was brief, written in his usual calm, clinical tone. But years later, one of his officers remembered asking him if he believed radar had replaced the human element in war. Lee smiled faintly and said, "No, it didn't replace it. It just taught us how blind we were." Washington survived the war. Her radar, upgraded again and again, outlived every commander who had once doubted it. The Mark 8 became the ancestor of the systems that would guide missiles, track satellites, and map the weather. What began as a faint echo in Ironbottom Sound became the language of modern warfare. Invisible, mathematical, absolute. When the war ended in 1945, naval officers toured the wreck sites around Guadalcanal. Among them was a radar technician from Washington. He stood on a small launch above the coordinates where Kirishima lay buried. The sea was calm, the surface bright as glass. He said nothing for a long time, then tapped the surface of the water with his hand and whispered, "She never saw us coming." It was not arrogance. It was realization. The age of vision had ended in the dark, and the age of information had begun there too. The sea itself had changed that night, not because of what men saw, but because of what they learned to trust. If stories like this remind you how innovation and courage reshaped the very meaning of warfare, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and join our crew of history enthusiasts. Every day, we uncover another moment when the world changed, not through noise or glory, but through silence, precision, and light no eye could see.